This is Aaron Hobson of Rhinebeck School of Music, and in this video we're going to learn all about the wonderful world of augmented triads. So you can do these with seventh chords, but I'm trying to keep everything simple, working with triads first, and then we can talk about seventh chords later. So the poor augmented chord is so lonely in the world, rarely gets used, and the reason why is it just sounds so bad and unresolved and awful sounding, or as one of my students put it, it sounds annoyed. So if you're someone who doesn't like a lot of tension in music, this chord may not be for you. But maybe it's just because you've never learned how to use it, or you've never thought of how to use it before. So I'm just going to go over some basics of the chord, the theory of the chord, some basic formations that you can start to put into your chord vocabulary, and then talk about some song examples where you've heard this and a couple of ways that you can use this chord in music. So first of all, the augmented chord is based on a major triad. So if we go back to our trusty C major triad, C, E, G, we're going to sharp the 5. So here's my regular C chord that has an open G. We're going to take the G, which is the 5th of the chord, and we're going to sharp it to a G sharp. And now we have this really dreamy sounding chord, right? And then you can kind of start to do that with your basic chords that you know. So here's your D chord. The 5th of D is A, so we're going to move that up 1 fret to A sharp. Now we have a D augmented. How about with the F chord? We're going to find our 5th, which is C, and we're going to sharp that. Now we have an F augmented. How about our A chord? Here's our A, here's our 5th, which is E, and we're going to raise that to an E sharp, and now we have an A augmented. So you can take all the chords that you normally play, turn them into augmented chords. Why would you want to do that? Because it can be fun, trust me. So the cool thing about the augmented chord, like the diminished chord, we talked about how a diminished chord is called symmetrical, meaning it's based on all intervals of a minor third. So if you move it every 3 frets, you get the same chord, just a different inversion. You can do that with this D augmented here. So we sharp the 5. If you move it every 4 frets, because the augmented chord is based on all intervals of a major third. So every 4 frets you get the same D augmented, just a different inversion of that chord. So the ways that you will commonly see these written in notation, for the C augmented, for example, using C as an example of the root, you might see it as a C plus. That plus sign means augmented. You might see it as a C plus 5, C sharp 5. You may see it as the C with the sharp sign 5. You may see it as C-A-U-G, short for augmented, right? And I always think of everything in terms of language too. So augmented is just another word for sharp, really, in the musical vocabulary. And augmented in English means to make larger, right? So you're just taking that 5th and you're making it larger, you're augmenting it, you're making it, you're sharpening it, essentially. So here's a couple song examples that use it as an introduction to the song. So in these examples, they're going to take the 5 chord, which is typically either a major chord or a dominant 7 chord, and then they're going to take that dominant 7 chord, they're going to make it an augmented chord. So the first example, everybody uses this one, Oh Darling by the Beatles. It's in the key of A. So the 5 chord is E, right? But instead of playing like an E7, which this is what an E7 would sound like, oh darling, they make that E an augmented, so it sounds like this. Oh darling, please believe me, I'll never do you no harm. So that E7's perfectly fine. Oh, darling, with that little tension of that augmented chord. Oh, darling, just makes it a little hipper. So another one that uses an augmented chord as the beginning of the song is School Days by Chuck Berry. So of course a lot of his stuff is the blues form, the 12-bar blues form. This particular song is in the key of G. So the 5 chord is going to be D, but he like I said, you can play these different inversions of your D chord augmented. We're going to augment that chord move it every 4 frets, and we're going to play it in the high spot here on the 10th and the 11th fret. So that's how he starts the song, right? So you've got up in the morning and out to school, right? So you could use a regular D chord or a D7. Up in the morning and out to school. But he augments that chord to make it just a little bit more tense. Up in the morning and out to school. So either work, but if you put that augmented chord in there, it just sounds a little hipper. All right, another great example, turning that 5 dominant chord or major chord into an augmented chord. Crying by Roy Orbison. This song is in the key of D, and the chord progression is just D to D augmented to G minor. And we talked about what this is. This is borrowed harmony from the parallel minor key. So if you want to check out borrowed harmony, turning the 4-chord minor in a major key, that's just a borrowed chord from the minor key. So you can search for that on Patreon too. Here's how this one goes. I was all right for a while. I could smile for a while. But I saw you last night. You held my hand so tight as you stopped to say hello. So right there, instead of, he could go D to D7 to G minor, but that augmented just sounds so cool. So, oh, a little bit of tension. Then you stop to say hello. So he brings that augmented chord back in the chorus. Same progression, but now alone and crying, 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 crying. So again, it builds like this tension, this anticipation, and then resolves it. So it sounds really cool. Another example, It's My Party, Leslie Gore. So that one's in the key of A. Same chord progression as Crying, except for a different key. So we're gonna go A to A augmented to D minor. It's my party and I'll cry if I want to, cry if I want to, cry if I want to. You would cry too if it happened to you. So A, she could have gone A, A7, D minor, but she went A augmented, a little bit more tense, a little more tension. All right, so that's using it as a sub for the 5 chord of a key. Now this next example is using it just kind of floating around off of a major chord, taking the 5th, bringing it to a sharp 5, resolving it to a major 6, a D6 chord, and then back. So my first example, like I play this jazz standard called Lucky Southern by Keith Jarrett. So the whole introduction of the song is a D to a D augmented to a D6 to a D augmented. And I kind of have fun with it and I bring it around to different inversions, right? Kind of play around with it a little bit. Here's my D up here, my D augmented. Bring the B into the picture, you have a D6. So that's really just taking the 5th of the chord, sharpening it, resolving it to the 6, and then coming back. So it has this kind of floating tension that doesn't really resolve, and it's just sort of in this weird dream-like state. Eventually it resolves. So another example of that in the same key, Baby Hold On by Eddie Money. Kind of floats in the verses just between a D and a D augmented. Then it kind of, to climb up to the 4 chord, the G chord, they're going to go D augmented, which gives you an A sharp, D6, which gives you a B, D7, which gives you a C. So they're climbing up chromatically over that D chord, and then it resolves to G. So it's very satisfying. You know, listen to this tension build up, right? Right to the G. Sounds really nice. So this one goes, baby, hold on to me. Whatever will be of that G. So the last example of this, Cigarettes and Coffee by Otis Redding, that's in the key of G. And what happens, this is in 6/8 time, there's this little vamp that goes from the G to the G augmented, to the G6, to the G augmented over and over again. So again, you have your 5th, D, of the chord. You sharp it to D sharp, resolve it to E, and then go back. So you're floating around on the 5th of the chord, creating this cool tension, and it sounds really cool. Now I'm not going to attempt to sing this song because I cannot do it justice, but you can listen to it on your own, and I'll just play the chord progression, which goes G, G augmented, G6, G augmented, G, G augmented, G6, then G7, and then it resolves to the 4 chord C. So it's cool if you can add this tension in music and then resolve it, because it kind of builds this like anticipation. You kind of feel like, ooh, wow, like a little bit unresolved, and then you're like, oh, you're so satisfied by the time they actually like put in a chord that resolves everything. So again, to recap, you can use it as the 5 chord of a key, and you can also use it kind of to float around in between on your major chord, just creating tensions off of the 5th of your chord. So if you haven't already, visit www.rhinebeckschoolofmusic.com. Become a patron, www.patreon.com/Rhinebeck School of Music. See you at the next one.